One coffin, one country in mourning, and somewhere else, missiles already falling. This is not a metaphor. This is the exact hour the Middle East is living through right now. While millions of people stood shoulder to shoulder in the streets of Tehran, grieving a man who ruled their lives for almost 40 years, Israeli jets were already crossing into Lebanese airspace. Two nations, two ceremonies. One buries its dead, the other keeps making more. If you think this is just another headline about the Middle East, wait until you see how these two events are connected, because they are not separate stories. They are two halves of the same war, unfolding on the same afternoon, on opposite sides of a border that has bled for decades. Let's go back to where this really begins. On the 28th of February this year, in the early morning hours, the sky over Tehran opened up in a way most Iranians had never imagined possible. A joint American-Israeli operation struck the private residence of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, the man who had held absolute religious and political power since 1989. He was 86 years old. He was killed instantly, along with his daughter, his son-in-law, his daughter-in-law, and a grandchild. Within hours, an entire regime built around one man's authority had to face a question it had never truly answered. What happens when the untouchable is touched? For a government that presented its leader as almost beyond mortality, this was not just an assassination. It was a rupture in the story Iran had told itself for 4 decades. And the strangest part is what happened next, on the streets of Tehran itself. Some wept, some prayed, and some, in certain neighborhoods, quietly celebrated. Gunfire and cheering were reported in cities like Sabzavar. This detail matters more than it seems. A nation mourning its supreme leader, while parts of its own population rejoice in the shadows, tells you something the state media will never say out loud. Grief, in Iran that week, was not universal. It was political. It depended entirely on which side of the regime's brutality you had lived through. And that context is crucial, because just weeks before Khamenei's death, Iran had been drowning in a different kind of blood. In January, mass protests erupted across the country, driven by economic collapse and public fury. The regime's response was merciless. Human rights monitors estimate that thousands of civilians were killed in the crackdown that followed. So when foreign missiles killed the man responsible for that crackdown, the reaction inside Iran was never going to be simple. It was going to be layered, painful, and in places, quietly triumphant. This is the psychological trap dictatorships build for themselves. When you rule through fear for long enough, your death does not just end a life. It exposes exactly how loved or how feared you truly were. Now, here is where the story takes its first real turn. Khamenei's funeral was not held for months. Think about that. A supreme leader, dead, and his own government could not bury him. Why? Because the war his death triggered simply would not stop. The strikes between the United States, Israel, and Iran continued through March, April, May, and into June. A ceasefire was announced in April. It broke down. A memorandum to end the war was eventually signed in mid-June at the Palace of Versailles. A strange and almost cinematic detail in itself. A peace document for a Middle Eastern war signed inside a French palace built for kings. But even that agreement did not bring quiet. Tensions kept flaring. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important oil corridors on the planet, became a flashpoint of its own, with Iran threatening to block it entirely. So for 4 months, Khamenei's body waited. 4 months of a nation unable to complete its most basic ritual of closure. 4 months where power inside Iran existed in a strange, suspended state, because the man who was supposed to inherit that power was nowhere to be seen. That man is Mojtaba Khamenei, the late leader's 56-year-old son. He was announced as the new supreme leader in March, and then he vanished from public life entirely. No appearances, no speeches, not even an audio message to his own people. Sources close to the matter describe severe injuries from the same strike that killed his father, burns across his face and body, multiple surgeries on one leg. But there is something else here too, something heavier than physical wounds. A leader who cannot be seen is a leader whose authority is, in a very real sense, unproven. In a country built on symbolism and public devotion, invisibility is its own kind of danger. And it gets stranger. When the funeral finally happened in early July, his own representatives confirmed he would not attend. Officially, the reason given was security, a credible fear that Israel could target the event itself. Unofficially, ask yourself this question. What does it mean when a nation's new supreme leader is too afraid or too incapacitated to stand beside his own father's coffin? This is not a minor detail. This is the heart of the story, because everything that follows, the funeral, the crowds, the flags, the chants, exists partly to cover for that absence. Let's talk about the funeral itself, because the scale of it is almost impossible to picture from a distance. Iranian officials expected millions of mourners, with some estimates suggesting the crowds could rival or even surpass the 10 million people who gathered in 1989 for the funeral of Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic. That earlier funeral is remembered for chaos, for a body nearly falling from its coffin under the weight of the crowd. This time, the state was determined to control every second. The ceremony stretched across 6 days and multiple countries. It began at the Imam Khomeini Grand Mosalla in Tehran, a massive prayer complex built for exactly this kind of national spectacle. Mourners in black clothing filled the streets under blistering summer heat, temperatures reaching 36 degrees Celsius, with misting fans installed to keep the crowds from collapsing. Chest-beating rituals echoed through loudspeakers. Women wept. Men chanted a single word, over and over: revenge. From Tehran, the procession moved to Qom, Iran's spiritual capital, home to some of the holiest sites in Shia Islam. From there, extraordinary as it sounds, the body crossed the border into Iraq for ceremonies in Najaf and Karbala, cities that hold religious weight for millions of Shia Muslims across the entire region. And finally, the body was taken to Mashhad, Khamenei's own birthplace, to be buried at the shrine of Imam Reza, one of the most sacred locations in the country. Here is the part that should make you pause. This funeral crossed international borders. It moved through a war zone. It required coordination between two governments, Iran and Iraq, in the middle of an active regional conflict. That is not simply a religious event. That is a projection of power, a way of telling the world and telling Iran's own citizens that even after losing its supreme leader in a foreign strike, the system still functions, still commands loyalty, still controls the narrative from beginning to end. One analyst described it precisely. This funeral is basically a political event dressed as a religious one. Its purpose is to project legitimacy at home and deterrence abroad. Read that again because it is the key to understanding everything else in this story. A funeral used as a message. Grief turned into strategy. And the guest list proves it. Representatives from more than 100 countries attended. Pakistan sent its prime minister and army chief. Russia sent former President Dmitry Medvedev. Delegations arrived from Tajikistan, Armenia, Georgia, Turkey, India, Bangladesh. Even Saudi Arabia, a nation that has been at odds with Iran for decades, unexpectedly sent its vice foreign minister. Hamas sent representatives. So did the family of Hassan Nasrallah, the former Hezbollah leader killed by Israel back in 2024. Think about what that guest list actually represents. It is not simply mourning. It is a map of alliances, rivalries, and calculated diplomacy, all gathered in one square in Tehran. Every handshake at that funeral was a signal. Every absence was a message too. And one particular voice cut through everything. At the funeral, a poet stood in front of hundreds of thousands of mourners and called for the death of the American president, drawing loud cheers from the crowd. This happened while the United States and Iran were, at that very moment, engaged in indirect negotiations to end the war permanently. Public fury on one stage, private diplomacy on another, both happening within the same 24 hours. This is the paradox at the center of modern conflict. Nations can be negotiating peace and performing hatred simultaneously because both serve a purpose. The negotiation buys time and reduces military cost. The performance keeps domestic anger satisfied, keeps the population believing the fight is not over, keeps the leadership looking strong even while quietly seeking an exit. Even the American president could not resist commenting on the spectacle. In a speech given the same week, he claimed the United States had given Iran, in his words, a week off for the funeral, adding that they had even considered striking the gathering itself, remarking that killing everyone there would have left no one left to negotiate with. Whether you read that as dark humor, genuine restraint, or calculated intimidation, it tells you something disturbing. A funeral for millions of grieving people became, for a foreign leader, a subject for a punchline about who to kill and who to keep alive for negotiation. That is how thoroughly war can strip the humanity out of even the most sacred human ritual. Now let's shift south, across the border to Lebanon. Because while Tehran built its six-day spectacle of mourning, Israel was not pausing. Just days before the funeral began, Israel and the Lebanese government had signed a new framework agreement, brokered by the United States, aimed at reducing hostilities and outlining a partial Israeli withdrawal from two contested areas in southern Lebanon. On paper, this looked like progress. In practice, it barely survived the ink drying. Hezbollah was never part of that negotiation. The agreement was made between states, while the armed group that actually controls much of southern Lebanon's military reality was left outside the room entirely. Hezbollah publicly rejected the deal, demanding nothing less than a complete Israeli withdrawal. And Israel, almost immediately, approved continued military operations inside Lebanese territory, despite having just signed a document meant to calm exactly that kind of activity. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reveals something important about how modern ceasefires actually function. A signature on paper does not end a war, it simply changes its rhythm. The agreement gave Israel a diplomatic shield, something to point to and say, "We are committed to peace," while simultaneously allowing military strikes to continue under the justification of self-defense and enforcement. And so, during the very days Iran was burying its supreme leader, Israeli forces struck roughly 10 sites across southern Lebanon that it described as Hezbollah infrastructure. The military also claimed, in a statement posted publicly, that it had hit a truck transporting weapons near what it calls the security zone. Separately, Israeli soldiers reportedly killed an armed individual near the town of Majd al-Zun, close to the same border area that has seen fighting for years. None of this happened in isolation. This is the continuation of a war that stretches back far longer than most people realize. Hezbollah began firing on Israel in October 2023, describing it as solidarity with Gaza. A year of exchanges followed. Then, in October 2024, Israel launched a ground invasion into southern Lebanon. That operation ended, officially, with a ceasefire in late November 2024, but not before Israel killed Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's longtime leader, a man who had shaped the organization for over 3 decades. A ceasefire was signed, but the killing did not stop. Between that ceasefire and the following year, more than 300 people were killed in Lebanon by continued Israeli strikes, more than 100 of them civilians. By the end of last year, that number had climbed past 500. And in the months of open war that followed the assassination of Khamenei in February, that number surged dramatically higher, with more than 4,000 deaths in Lebanon linked to Israeli strikes, and over 1 million people, more than a fifth of the country's entire population, forced from their homes. Let that number settle for a second. 1 in 5 people in an entire country pushed out of their own home. Imagine that scale in a country you know personally. Entire neighborhoods emptied, not for weeks but for months, some for over a year. And here lies one of the most quietly devastating parts of this entire story. One that rarely makes the headlines because it does not involve a missile or a body count. It involves absence. Displaced families across Lebanon have described returning to villages that no longer resemble the places they grew up in. Homes reduced to concrete skeletons. Streets that once held childhood memories now holding nothing but rubble and silence. War does not just kill people. It erases the physical anchors of identity, the exact places where memory used to live. When a home is destroyed, the loss is not only material. It is a kind of quiet, permanent grief that never gets a funeral, never gets 6 days of national mourning, never gets millions of people chanting in the streets. This is the contrast the title of this story points to, and it deserves to be said plainly. One nation buried its leader with unmatched ceremony, borders crossed, holy cities visited, world leaders in attendance. Another nation's people are still searching through wreckage for the version of home they used to know, with no ceremony at all, no global attention, simply the daily grinding reality of displacement. Why does Israel keep striking Lebanon even after signing agreements meant to reduce exactly that kind of violence? To understand this, you have to understand the strategic logic driving Israeli decision-making since October 2023. From Israel's perspective, Hezbollah used the earlier ceasefire period to rebuild weapons stockpiles, command structures, underground infrastructure. Israeli intelligence assessments, repeated publicly by military leadership, describe this as a direct violation of the 2024 agreement's spirit, even where it may not violate its letter. So Israel's military doctrine has shifted towards something called active enforcement, meaning strikes are not treated as new acts of war, but as maintenance of an existing ceasefire, preventing what officials describe as inevitable future attacks. It is a doctrine that blurs the line between peacekeeping and continuous low-intensity war. And whether you view that as necessary deterrence or unchecked aggression likely depends entirely on which side of the border you were born on. There is also a quieter, more psychological layer to this pattern of behavior. A ceasefire that is enforced through repeated unilateral strikes sends a specific message to every actor in the region, not just Hezbollah. It tells Iran, it tells the new and untested leadership in Tehran, it tells every proxy group from Yemen to Iraq that Israeli restraint has limits, and that even in the middle of another nation's darkest moment of mourning, operations will continue exactly as planned. It is deterrence built not through announcements, but through timing itself. And timing, in this story, is everything. Because striking Lebanon during Khamenei's funeral week is not incidental. It is a message aimed directly at Tehran's new and fragile leadership. It says, "We see your show of strength, your millions in the streets, your foreign delegations, your chance of revenge, and none of it changes our calendar." Power, in this region, is often communicated less through words and more through the precise choice of when to act. Meanwhile, back in Doha, where indirect negotiations between the United States and Iran had reportedly been making what officials called positive progress, Iran chose to pause all diplomacy for the duration of the funeral. On the surface, this looks like simple respect for a period of mourning. But diplomatically, it is also a form of leverage. Walking away from the table, even temporarily, forces the other side to wait, to wonder, to reconsider its own urgency. In negotiations shaped by nuclear tension, oil routes, and military exhaustion, even a pause can be a weapon. So here is where all these threads finally meet. A leader is killed in February, triggering a war that reshapes an entire region. A funeral, delayed by that very war, becomes a massive display of religious and political theater 4 months later. A new leader, wounded and unseen, tries to inherit unquestioned authority without ever appearing in public. World powers attend not out of pure grief, but out of calculated diplomacy. And on the other side of a battered border, Israeli strikes continue in Lebanon precisely during this period, part enforcement, part warning, part demonstration that no ceremony, however massive, will interrupt its military timeline. None of this is random. Every element, the funeral route through 4 cities and 2 countries, the timing of Israeli strikes, the president's public remarks, the pause in negotiations, functions as a message aimed at multiple audiences simultaneously. Domestic populations, rival governments, armed proxy groups, even history itself, watching to see how this moment will be remembered. And this is really what makes modern geopolitical conflict so difficult to fully grasp from the outside. It rarely moves in a single straight line. It moves in layers, ceremony over strategy, mourning over deterrence, diplomacy over threat, each one hiding underneath the surface of the other, waiting for someone patient enough to notice the pattern. So what happens next? Mojtaba Khamenei remains largely invisible, his authority resting on inheritance rather than public trust, in a country whose citizens are simultaneously exhausted by war and unresolved in their feelings about the man just buried. Lebanon continues absorbing strikes under an agreement that exists more as a diplomatic label than a functioning peace. And the wider negotiations between Washington and Tehran continue in the shadows, moving forward just enough to avoid total collapse, but never quite enough to guarantee the fighting is truly finished. Perhaps the most unsettling truth in this entire story is this: ceasefires in this region rarely mean the end of violence. They mean a change in its shape, a shift from open war to something quieter, strikes described as enforcement, deaths that no longer make international headlines, displacement that continues long after the news cameras move elsewhere. Tehran buried a man it built into something more than human, only to discover, in the raw and divided reaction on its own streets, exactly how fragile that myth had become. Lebanon, meanwhile, keeps burying something else entirely, not a single leader, but pieces of ordinary life, homes, routines, the quiet certainty that tomorrow will look like yesterday. Two funerals in a way, one with millions of mourners and cameras from 100 countries, the other with no cameras at all. And that, perhaps, is the real question worth carrying with you after this story ends. When the world watches one funeral so closely that it forgets to watch the other, what does that tell us about whose grief we have decided actually matters?